Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are we doing? Spectre here with another edition of Midnight Rider. Good to have you aboard here. Tonight on the broadcast, going to do something a little bit different that I've long alluded to. And now that we've gotten good old Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness book out of the way, and the 6 parts in that we covered it in, tonight I'm going to begin a new book, Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So that's what we're going to get into here tonight. So stick around and we'll see you back on the other side. Rule number 1. Power is not only what you have, but what the enemy you have. Rule number 2. Never go outside the expertise of your people. Rule number 3. If possible, go outside the expertise of the enemy. Rule number 4. The enemy alone. Rule number 5. Is man's most potent weapon. Rule number 6. A good tactic is one your people. Rule number 7. A tactic that drags on too. Rule number 8. Keep the pressure on. Never let up. Rule number 9. The threat is using itself. The major is a development constant pressure upon. Rule number 11. If hard enough, it will and become a positive. Rule number price of a successful attack of alternative. Rule number 13. Pick the target, personalize it, and polarize it. Lest we forget an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first from all our legends, mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which. First, radical, known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it that he at least won his own kingdom. By Saul Alinsky. This is PSA. Alright, welcome back everybody. I see a few of you guys out in chat here tonight saying the sound is a little bit choppy. I'm not sure what's going on there. Looks like I'm pretty well green across the board transmitting the signal out, so I'm not sure why per se that's happening here tonight, but maybe it's time for a reboot, who knows. We'll get her sorted out, but again, tonight on the broadcast, if you've been with me for a while, you know that I've covered the old Federalist Papers. We've been through the Constitution. We've been through the old Declaration of Independence. Just finished covering Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness. And of course, this is kind of the impetus of it. If you remember right here, maybe about a month and a half ago, I covered out of the Western Journal, the exclusive from General Flynn, 5 Lessons I Learned When the Deep State Came After Me and My Family. And one of the things that he highlighted that he thought, and I as well agree, faith in God is an essential part of the fight to restore American greatness. Our personal faith is inextricably linked to our personal liberties. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French author of the groundbreaking work Democracy in America, wrote, "Upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. The Americans combined the notions of Christianity and of liberty so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive the one without the other. De Tocqueville is exactly right. Prior to America's founding, no document in the world had directly linked the individual rights of citizens to their unique value and autonomy before an omnipotent creator. And so, in this article that he talks about this back in March now, he highlights the very documents in that I've gone over. And so I thought, it's been a while since I've been through this good old book. It's probably been, I'd say, at least a good 6, 8, maybe years long ago since I last read it. I thought, what the heck? It's only about 300 some pages, so we'll see if we can try and knock it out. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So periodically, if you join the broadcast here, as I cover some of the regular news, the financials, and whatever else is going on in the world, and, just to get a little break from things, circle back, if you will, to something a little bit more favorable to put us in a little bit of an uplifting spirit, as it were. So tonight seems to be the night to kick that off, and that's what we're going to do here. And again, if you're joining, you can find this book over on Amazon. You can find it in the description, I believe. Maybe I got it out there. I don't know. If nothing else, it'll be on the upload side here later once I get it over to my archive channels. You can find it certainly on Amazon. This is the version in that I'm reading from. This one dates back to, I believe, 1956. The version in that I'm going to be reading from here, 1805 to 1859. Yeah, 1956 is a publication date there. There are several others in that you can find on Amazon that are more recent. I don't know how well they will follow, but nonetheless, this is what we're going to go from here this evening. So, kicking it off, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville. This is the specially edited and abridged for the modern reader by Richard D. Hefner. And so tonight we'll see how far we get, either within an hour's time or where a good breakpoint is. And we'll just carry on as we see fit. That being said, let's get her done. So, a great political classic. Over 100 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville, a young French nobleman and an astute political scientist, came to the United States to appraise the meaning and actual functioning of democracy in order to understand how it might serve to supplant the outworn aristocratic regime in Europe. Flash forward to today, one might suggest that perhaps we are in that very same aristocratic state that we tried to escape. And Democracy in America, the classic treatise on the American way of life, which he wrote as a result of his visit, Tocqueville discusses the advantages and dangers of the majority rule, which he thought could be as tyrannical as the rule of the aristocracy. He analyzes the influence of political parties and the press on the government, the effect of democracy on the social, political, and economic life of the American people, and offers some startling predictions about world politics which history has borne out. So brilliant and penetrating are his comments and criticisms that they have vital meaning today for all who are interested in democracy. Richard D. Hefner, historian, radio and television commentator, and author of A Documentary History of the United States, has selected Tocqueville's most striking and pertinent passages to make this masterful political critique available in a compact, inexpensive edition for the modern reader. And so, other mentor books you'll enjoy: Documentary History of the United States, Richard D. Hefner; American Perspective, edited by Henry Steele Commager; The Democratic Way of Life by T.V. Smith and Edward C. Lindeman; The Living U.S. Constitution, edited by Saul K. Padover; The Age of Jackson, abridged by Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr.; American Essays, expanded, edited by Charles B. Shaw. And to our readers, we welcome your comments about Signet Key, and Mentor Books. There we go. All right, so that's talking about the author. And so, again, Democracy in America, Richard Hefner. And away we go. 1956, all rights reserved. First printing, February 1956. And it looks like we'll just read through the contents here just to kind of get a little lay of the land. Introduction to the Mentor Edition, Richard D. Hefner, author's introduction. We'll cover that here momentarily. Part 1, we'll cover these chapters: Origin of the Anglo-Americans, Democratic Social Condition of the Anglo-Americans, the Sovereignty of the People in America, Local Government, Decentralization in America, its effects, Judicial Power in the United States and its influence on political society, Aspects of the Federal Constitution, Political parties, liberty of the press in the United States, political associations in the United States, advantages of democracy in the United States, unlimited power of the majority in the United States and its consequences, causes which mitigate the tyranny of the majority in the United States, causes which tend to maintain democracy, future prospects of the United States. Then we'll hit Part 2, Book 1, Influence of Democracy upon the Action of Intellect in the United States, the Philosophical Method of the Americans, 1 and 2, Influence of Democracy on Religion. Equality suggests to the Americans the idea of the indefinite perfectibility of man. The example of the Americans does not prove that a democratic people can have no aptitude and no taste for science, literature, or art. Why the Americans are more addicted to practical than to theoretical science. In what spirit the Americans cultivate the arts. Literary characteristics of democratic times. Let's see. Also, of some sources of poetry amongst democratic nations. Why American writers and orators often use an inflated style. Some characteristics of historians in democratic times. Then we'll get to Book 2, The Influence of Democracy on the Feelings of the Americans. Why democratic nations show a more ardent and enduring love of equality than of liberty. Of individualism in democratic countries. That the Americans combat the effects of individualism by free institutions. Of the use which the Americans make of public associations in civil life. Of the relations between public associations and the newspapers. Relation of civil to political associations, of the taste for physical well-being in America, what causes almost all Americans to follow industrial callings, how an aristocracy may be created by manufacturers. Book 3 of this, Influence of Democracy on Manners, properly so called, how democracy renders the habitual intercourse of the Americans simple and easy. Why the Americans show so little sensitiveness in their own country and are so sensitive in Europe. Influence of democracy on wages. Influence of democracy on the family. Young women in a democracy. How equality of condition contributes to maintain good morals in America. How the Americans understand the equality of the sexes. How the principle of equality naturally divides the Americans into a multitude of small private circles. Some reflections on American manners, why the national vanity of the Americans is more restless and captious than that of the English, how the aspect of society in the United States is at once excited and monotonous, why so many ambitious men and so little lofty ambition are to be found in the United States, the trade of place hunting in certain democratic countries, why great revolutions will become more rare, why democratic nations are naturally desirous of peace and democratic armies of war. Causes which render democratic armies weaker than other armies at the outset of a campaign and more formidable in protracted warfare. Some considerations on war in democratic communities. Book 4, Influence of Democratic Ideas and Feelings on Political Society. Equality naturally gives men a taste for free institutions. That the opinions of democratic nations about government are naturally favorable to the concentration of power. That the sentiments of democratic nations accord with their opinions in leading them to concentrate political power. Of certain peculiar and accidental causes which either lead a people to complete the decentralization of government or which divert them from it. Now, what sort of despotism democratic nations have to fear, and general survey of the subject will kind of round things out. So we've got a lot of ground to cover here, broken into the 4 books, if you will, that this depicts, 57 chapters, 314 pages, and we'll just take it one episode at a time. So, Introduction to the Mentor Edition. Alexis de Tocqueville arrived in the United States in May 1831 and departed its shores for his native France once again in February 1832, only 9 months later. Yet, for considerably more than a century now, Tocqueville's Democracy in America has provided its readers an unparalleled abundance of description, analysis, and prophecy concerning almost every aspect of the American scene. The first part of the young Frenchman's classic critique begins with a brief description of the New World's physical dimensions, of the origins of Anglo-Americans, and of America's most striking characteristic, democracy and the absolute sovereignty of the people. There follows a somewhat outdated summary of the workings of American government, then an analysis of the book's central theme, the tyranny of the majority in the United States. In its second part, Democracy in America deals with the impact of democracy or majority rule upon the structure and dynamics of American society, upon the way Americans think and feel and act, upon the essential nature of our freedoms. It is here that Tocqueville actually makes his most unique and prophetic contributions to contemporary thought. For above all else, Tocqueville's concern is for the development and survival of both freedom and democracy. And today, at mid-20th century, surely there is no other theme so meaningful and so imperative for Americans and for free people everywhere. First published in 1835 and 1840, Democracy in America remains preeminently a tract for our times. 1. Ever since the emergence of Jacksonian democracy in the 1820s and 1830s, the most pervasive myth to dominate American political thinking has been our rather naive and mistaken equation of equality with freedom, of democracy, or majority rule, with liberty. Long before the age of Jackson, of course, Thomas Jefferson had set forth the proposition that all men are created equal as the philosophical basis of the Declaration of Independence. And as far back as the so-called Revolution of 1800, majority rule had triumphed in America when the Federalist Party, a minority party of the rich and the well-born, was permanently driven from national office by the numerically superior Jeffersonian Democrats. Yet our early leaders, even the Jeffersonians, were themselves essentially far from equalitarian in outlook. They believed in government of and for the people, but not by the people. And, more important, they were much too dedicated to the principles of individual liberty and freedom ever to equate them necessarily and irrevocably with equality and democracy. Thus, it was not until Jackson's time that equalitarianism became the overriding theme of American life, with majority rule its most convenient rule of thumb. Then American political thought and institutions underwent the most profound transformation as political control was rapidly shifted from an older aristocracy of education, position, and wealth to the common man, the average American. To provide for the untrammeled rule of the majority, restrictions on the suffrage were removed. Property qualifications for office were abolished. Terms of office were limited, and the number of appointive or non-elective positions was drastically cut down. In short, king numbers came quickly to reign supreme, and popular feeling became almost totally involved with the notion of majority rule. In public office, the new equalitarianism meant that all men were of essentially equal talents, that each American was capable of holding any position in government, and that democracy required a rotation in office to prevent the development of an untouchable bureaucratic elite or aristocracy. The notion that to the victors belong the spoils was the most forthright expression of the simple democratic instinct for replacing office holders whose party had been repudiated, even or with those who were more clearly the people's choice. And the roaring mobs that pushed and fought their way into Andrew Jackson's inaugural reception, that knocked over punch bowls, smashed glasses, and trod in muddy boots on White House tables and chairs, made it abundantly clear that at long last equality had become the hallmark of American life. It was in the midst of this riotous early ferment of democracy and equality that Alexis de Tocqueville made his grand tour of the United States, and surely no other observer has ever as perceptively noted or so well described these now widely accepted twin themes of American life. Indeed, in the very introduction to Democracy in America, Tocqueville wrote that, "Amongst the novel objects that attracted my attention in the United States, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of condition among the people. The more I advanced in the study of American society, the more I perceived that this equality of condition is the fundamental fact from which all others seem to be derived." While about democracy or majority rule, the young Frenchman observed further on in his study that the people reign in the American political world as the deity does in the universe. Yet Tocqueville was merely reporting, not approving. Democracy in America is no paean to the virtues of equalitarianism and majority rule. Quite to the contrary. And this is precisely what makes it so provocative and valuable for us today. This classic study thoroughly rejects Americans' now more than century-old magical equation of equality with freedom, of democracy with liberty. No one would deny that in the Jackson era, Americans had ruthlessly swept away even the trappings of privilege and presumption, and had substituted the rule of the many for the rule of the few. But had equalitarianism and majority rule proved to be unmixed blessings? Tocqueville thought not. Indeed, what he had seen of the leveling doctrines that pervaded every area of national life led him to question whether Americans' liberties, whether Americans' older concern for individual differences and freedom, could actually long survive their new penchant for equality and democracy. For as conditions became more equal, Americans seemed more and more to take pride not in their individuality, in their personal liberties, in their freedom, but rather in their sameness. So that, as Tocqueville wrote, every citizen being assimilated to all the rest is lost in the crowd, and nothing stands conspicuous but the great and imposing image of the people at large. Increasingly then, Americans had subordinated their concern for their liberties and freedom of the individual to their new respect for, or fear of, the majority, the great and imposing image of the people at large. It seemed clear that equality and democracy, far from going hand in hand with liberty and freedom, had in the sacred name of the majority raised up instead a tyranny over the minds of men as oppressive and as formidable as any in history, the tyranny of the majority. And Tocqueville could write, "I know of no country in which there is so little independence of mind and real freedom of discussion as in America." That Alexis Charles Henry Clarel de Tocqueville should have been so critical of American democracy that he should have thrust quite so vigorously at its underlying assumptions was by all means appropriate, for the brilliant Frenchman was an aristocrat through and through, the heir of a distinguished tradition of good family, conservatism, and intellectual aloofness, an individuality that had no affinity at all to the rampant equalitarianism which characterized Jacksonian America. Born in Paris on July 29, 1805, Tocqueville was descended from a proud old Norman family that for long generations had been considered among the petite noblesse. Thus it required no particular devotion to the villainies of the Ancien regime to make Tocqueville initially suspicious of majority rule. The leveling doctrines of the French Revolution had already taken a heavy toll within his own family and circle of friends. During the Revolution, his parents had been jailed. His maternal grandfather, the Marquis of Rosambo, had been guillotined in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And though his father was ultimately returned to rank and position after the fall of Napoleon, Tocqueville's own childhood had been overshadowed by memories of those earlier popular excesses. In so many ways, then, he was both by birth and by circumstance ideally suited to the role of hostile critique of democracy in America. Yet this is by no means all that must be said of Tocqueville's preparation for his famous journey to America. For if it were, we would be obliged to discount the larger portion of his commentary as purely the product of personal spleen and vindictiveness. But our young Frenchman was actually no reactionary nobleman, no mere displaced aristocrat bitterly attached to an older order of things and vainly desirous of discrediting the rapidly spreading new democratic impulse. In fact, we find that though Tocqueville never abandoned what he considered the loftier ideals and values of his aristocratic heritage, still his lively instinct for fairness and justice had touched off in him an enormous sympathy for democratic ideas. He had studied and been much impressed by scholarly allusions to the seemingly inevitable progress of democracy. And within France herself, the Revolution of 1830 had further convinced him that the whole spirit of his age tended increasingly towards more equal and democratic conditions and institutions. Tocqueville's concern, then, was not to damn democracy, but rather to discover the weaknesses and the strengths of this movement which promised to play such a dominant role in the future. Having discovered them, he might reconcile them with the best aspects of the old order. The great political problem of our times, Tocqueville wrote, was not the destruction, but rather the organization and the establishment of democracy in Christendom. The Americans unquestionably have not resolved this problem, but they furnish useful data to those who undertake to resolve it. Ostensibly, Tocqueville and his friend Gustave de Beaumont had come to this country in May 1831 for the sole purpose of studying our prison system. Both young aristocrats were magistrates, and after all, a prison survey provided them an adequate excuse for visiting the New World. Actually, however, Tocqueville and Beaumont came primarily because of their intense eagerness to examine democracy at first hand, to see for themselves the actual workings of those equalitarian democratic doctrines that must ultimately be France's destiny. Democracy would inevitably come to their beloved France and to the rest of the world. But if these two young men could detect its errors and shortcomings in America, then at home they might at least prepare adequate safeguards for the inevitable, as Tocqueville himself wrote. It is not, then, merely to satisfy a legitimate curiosity that I have examined America. My wish has been to find there instruction by which we may ourselves profit. I confess that, in America, I saw more than America. I sought their image of democracy itself, with its inclinations, its character, its prejudices, and its passions, in order to learn what we have to fear or to hope from its progress. And in this superlative study, Tocqueville and Beaumont in America, George W. Pearson writes of the young aristocrats' purpose in coming to America. They would make democratie safe for the world. There is little question but that Tocqueville's single-minded concern for searching out the general principles of democracy in America, and for applying them to his native France, endowed his study with a timeliness and a philosophical scope that make it as important for our own period as it was for his. For here the reader is seldom caught up in a myriad of unrelated details concerning American life of a century and more ago. Instead, he is carried steadily along from one well-set-forth generalization to the next, always free to probe further those which are closest to his own interests. And the total picture that Tocqueville paints is coherent, well integrated, and meaningful. Yet, it was precisely because Tocqueville had such a definite purpose in mind when he came to America that he fell into a basic methodological trap. In his eagerness to generalize upon what he called the image of democracy, in order to learn what we have to fear or to hope from its progress, Tocqueville frequently indulged in the most blatant kind of a priori reasoning. New to America, and basically unfamiliar with its mores and institutions, he would formulate an abstract principle upon the scantiest substantive evidence, and then he would use his further observation only as proof of these somewhat intuitive generalizations, rather than as the basis of more objective conclusions. Lord Bryce, a British commentator on the American scene, who, a half-century after Tocqueville, would much more systematically examine the American Commonwealth, complained that though the Frenchman never consciously ignored a fact which might disprove his theories, nevertheless, Facts do not fall on his mind like seeds on virgin soil. There were, of course, other limitations as well that distracted somewhat from the general excellence of Tocqueville's critique. Sometimes his subjectivity and his avid concern for the broad implications of democracy in America kept him from seeing its details with precision and clarity, kept him from distinguishing between those patterns of thought and deed which were genuinely democratic in their origin, and those which were merely the product of a continuous frontier experience and an English heritage. Sometimes, too, Tocqueville's penchant for generalization kept him from seeing through to those many basic changes in American life that were starting to take place even as he wrote. Thus, to Tocqueville, the American presidency seemed to be almost an office without power. He described at length the forces that enfeebled the chief executive and seriously limited his influence, and he disparaged any likely presidential potential for boldness and leadership. But all of this was at the very moment that crusty old Andrew Jackson was in the White House, challenging the Supreme Court, vigorously forcing his will upon the Congress, and establishing a pattern of strong presidential leadership that would eventually be followed by Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I guess I'll pause there and think, how many of you remember whose picture was in the Oval Office behind a little Donald J. Trump? Was it not Jackson? There was still another major area in which Tocqueville failed to discern important changes in American life, for he was very much impressed with the power of the various states and with what seemed to him to be the inherent weakness of the national government. In time, he felt there might be as many as 100 million Americans in 40 states, and the disintegrating, decentralizing effect of such growth and expansion would mean a further weakening of the bonds of union. As the national government would grow even more remote from the average citizen, so national allegiance would be totally supplanted by loyalty to the individual states, or at best to regional blocks of states. And, of course, Tocqueville's visit to the United States did actually coincide with the rise of sectionalism and the South's cry for states' rights. He came at a time when antagonisms between East and West, North and South, were particularly bitter and pronounced, so that it was only natural that he should assume still a further decline in the power and prestige of the national government, and an ever-increasing loyalty to state and to section. What Tocqueville overlooked, however, in his quest for generalizations, were the many adhesive, nationalizing forces that eventually would bind together even 160 million Americans in 48 states, spread out over a whole continent. The Industrial Revolution, a widespread factory system, a vast transcontinental railroad network, endless highways, mass communications, the standardization of American food, clothing, shelter, and even ideas. All of these have bound Americans more tightly together since Tocqueville's time, and our union has actually been strengthened, not dissolved or even weakened, with an enormous accretion of national powers and a marked decline of state and regional loyalties. Tocqueville felt that in civil strife the Union must fall, but from 1861 to 1865 it survived the Holocaust of the Civil War and emerged stronger than ever before. Besides, as Lloyd Bryce suggested, it is a salutary warning to those who think it easy to get to the bottom of the political and social phenomena of a nation, to find that so keen and so industrious an observer as de Tocqueville, who has seized with unrivaled acuteness and described with consummate art many of the minor features of American politics, has omitted to notice several which had already begun to show their heads in his day, and have since become of the first importance. Among these, Bryce included the growing influence of money in politics. Even back then. The systematization and organization of party rivalry, and the rise of the reform movement, although Tocqueville and Beaumont had supposedly come here to study prison reforms. At other points, as well, democracy in America suffers grievously from omissions and misinterpretations that can be traced directly both to the author's too easy assumptions and to his desire not to report, but rather to summarize, interpret, and generalize. For all of Tocqueville's obvious inadequacies, and the often rather distressing subjectivity of his approach, still many of his generalizations concerning politics, religion, government, art, and even literature in democratic America are actually amazingly shrewd and perceptive in their way. This is what makes Democracy in America a great book. Even where his observations fail to stand up as credibly objective and accurate reporting on the contemporary scene, Tocqueville still ranks as something of a master prophet and political scientist. Many of his brilliant, intuitive thoughts into the dynamics of 19th century democratic life hold true for our own times as well, and one is over and over again astonished at the way history has borne out numbers of his most sweeping assumptions. It is quite clear, for instance, that Tocqueville misjudged the immediate strength and importance of the American presidency. Yet, at the very same time, the Frenchman was incredibly shrewd in his estimate of just what favors in American life would eventually increase presidential influence and authority far beyond even Jackson's fondest hopes. It is chiefly in its foreign relations that the executive power of a nation finds occasion to exert its skill and its strength. Tocqueville wrote, but for all practical purposes, in his own time, a nearly isolated America had no foreign relations. Separated by great oceans from the rest of the world, America was safe from foreign aggression. Her interests abroad were still comparatively small and unimportant, her dealings with other nations still at practically irreducible minimum. And though the president might possess what potentially were almost royal prerogatives, still, at the moment, physical isolation and a dearth of foreign relations thoroughly limited the executive's opportunities for exercising these prerogatives. Thus, it was neither law nor the Constitution, but rather circumstance alone that enfeebled presidential authority. And it is to Tocqueville's credit as an analyst and prophet that he so clearly perceived what new circumstances would in the future necessarily revolutionize the influence of the executive. If America were to become a great world power, and her early isolation were to become a thing of the past, then the division of governmental power would be different by far. If the existence of the Union were perpetually threatened, if its chief interests were in daily connection with those of other powerful nations, then the executive government would assume an increased importance in proportion to the measures expected of it and to those which it would execute. And today, few Americans would doubt that our own enormous concentration of power in the presidency has resulted at least in large part from America's emergence as a great world power in the years since World War I. Here at mid-20th century, our foreign relations have increased tremendously in scope and importance. Our executive finds increasing occasion to exert his skill and strength. Consequently, the president's almost royal prerogatives have now been largely realized, quite in keeping with Tocqueville's prophecy. About Americans' economic pursuits, too, Tocqueville made many wise observations. About Americans' intense love of wealth, their growing preference for commerce and industry over agriculture, their potential for vast material success. Americans make progress in industry, he wrote, because of their enormous ambition and their almost single-minded devotion to profitable activity. Besides, great fortunes were still to be made, and Tocqueville foresaw the rise of a ruthless industrial aristocracy, the robber barons of the late 19th century. Yet here Tocqueville perceived a fundamental contradiction in the American economy that its later Marxist critics could never really grasp, that while the manufacturing aristocracy which is growing up under our eyes is one of the harshest that ever existed in the world, at the same time it is one of the most confined and least dangerous. This because its wealth was not exclusive, its success not accompanied by the extremes of widespread poverty, nor by the polarization of society into only the very rich and the very poor. Flash forward to today. Look at the great wealth divide, right? There's us and them, the 0.1% versus the rest of the 99.9%. In a singularly brilliant chapter, Why Great Revolutions Will Become More Rare, Tocqueville pointed out that revolutions are made to destroy blatant inequalities. And, admittedly, in democratic America, enterprise and the love of wealth will produce a few massive fortunes. But the very poor will also be few in number. In the immense, neither rich nor poor majority of the nation will always hold a balance between them. Riches are well distributed in America, not concentrated, and the American class structure, as a Marxist can never see or accept, is characterized by fluidity rather than by stratification. Without being exactly either rich or poor, then most men possess sufficient property to desire the maintenance of order, yet not enough to excite envy. Such men are the natural enemies of violent commotions. Their stillness keeps the all beneath them and above them still, and secures the balance of the fabric of society. In such a land, then, amidst the conservatism bred by well-being, revolution must indeed be rare. And of course, we read this at a time when you have the Davos folks and the World Economic Forums, the likes of Klaus Schwab and their Great Reset. You will own nothing and be happy about it. No property rights? Few basic American character traits and social patterns escape the discerning Frenchman. Their addiction to practical rather than theoretical science, their pragmatic concern not for the lofty and the perfect, but for the quick and the useful. They will habitually prefer the useful to the beautiful, and they will require that the beautiful should be useful. Their inherent restlessness and ambition, their mutability and constant feverish activity. The whole life of an American is passed like a game of chance, a revolutionary crisis, or a battle. And their unending quest for devices and shortcuts. He who has set his heart exclusively upon the pursuit of worldly welfare is always in a hurry, for he has but a limited time at his disposal to reach, to grasp, and to enjoy it. In Part 2, in particular, Tocqueville's long catalogue of the influence of democracy, or equality, upon the intellect, manners, and the feelings of Americans remain shrewdly pertinent today. The transcendentalists of his own day seem to escape Tocqueville altogether. But of the future of literature in the American democracy, he was quite certain, and largely correct. Its practitioners would reach more and more millions, he prophesied, introducing democracy's trading, enterprising spirit into literature. And though some few writers of superior abilities would retain their individual brilliance and artistry, most writers would become tradesmen themselves. Style will frequently be fantastic, incorrect, overburdened, and loose, almost always vehement and bold. Authors will aim at rapidity of execution, more than at perfection of detail. There will be more wit than erudition, more imagination than profundity, and literary performances will bear marks of an untutored and rude vigor of thought. The object of authors will be to astonish rather than to please, and to stir the passions more than to charm the taste. In literature, as in the cultivation of all other arts, the so-called craftsman of democratic ages places a premium upon quantity rather than quality, upon profit rather than perfection. Religion, too, must feel the effects of democracy. Its forms and strictures become less rigid, though it continues to provide a substructure of belief and self-estimation for men whose seeming political freedom would otherwise make life and thought intolerably nebulous and infirm. Even the writing of history must be affected by democratic tendencies, with its emphasis placed not upon chance or upon the singular deeds and accomplishments of individual heroes and leaders, but, appropriately enough, upon mass movements and general causes instead. How astute an observation this was, of course, has been amply demonstrated by an American historiography which, since Tocqueville's time, has long been dominated by determinists of one kind or another, all more concerned with the giant forces that mold society than with the individual men who compose it. Tocqueville described and prophesied with equal perceptivity many other aspects of democratic America as well. The peculiarly important role of the legal profession, particularly of the judiciary, the power and vituperativeness of a free press, the extravagance of democratic manners, generally the range and intensity of the American's political interests. He speaks to you as if he was addressing a meeting, and if he should chance to become warm in the discussion, he will say, "Gentlemen," to the person with whom he is conversing. The long aversion to and slow preparation for war, and yet ultimately the capacity completely to mobilize a nation and to wage total, victorious war, the dangers of civil war inherent in the master-slave relationship between Negro and white. The young Frenchman also ferreted out an exceptionally significant American phenomenon by drawing attention to the multiplicity of public associations. Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations, religious, moral, serious, feudal, general, or restricted, enormous or diminutive, to give entertainments, to found seminaries, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the antipodes. Such private groups give individual men strength and substance in minor matters, prepare them for larger responsibilities, and perform functions that government would otherwise assume. Finally, of course, most prophetic of all, there is Tocqueville's shrewd estimate of America's future relationship with still another powerful nation. There are at the present time two great nations in the world, which started from different points, but seem to tend toward the same end. I allude to the Russians and the Americans. Both of them have grown up unnoticed, and whilst the attention of mankind was directed elsewhere, they have suddenly placed themselves in the front rank among the nations, and the world learned their existence and their greatness at almost the same time. All other nations seem to have nearly reached their natural limits, and they have only to maintain their power, but these are still in the act of growth. All the others have stopped or continue to advance with extreme difficulty. These alone are proceeding with ease and celerity along a path to which no limit can be perceived. The American struggles against the obstacles which nature opposes to him. The adversaries of the Russian are men. The former combats the wilderness and savage life, the latter civilization with all its arms. The conquests of the American are therefore gained by the plowshare, those of the Russian by the sword. The Anglo-American relies upon personal interest to accomplish his ends and give free scope to the unguided strength and common sense of the people. The Russian centers all the authority of society in a single arm. The principal instrument of the former is freedom, of the latter, servitude. Their starting point is different, and their courses are not the same, yet each of them seems marked out by the will of heaven to sway the destinies of half the globe. Now we have seen that Alexis de Tocqueville's interests ranged far into almost every aspect of American life. Yet in his own estimate, one theme in particular dominated all others: the growing tyranny of the majority, the ever-increasing and most formidable barriers raised by the majority around the free expression of opinion, and, as a result, the frightening oneness of American thinking, the absence of eccentricity and divergence from the norm. A perfect liberty of the mind exists in America, said Tocqueville, just as long as the sovereign majority has yet to decide its course. But once the majority has made up its mind, then all contrary thought must cease, and all controversy must be abandoned, not at the risk of death or physical punishment, but rather at the more subtle and more intolerable pain of ostracism, of being shunned by one's fellows, of being rejected by society. Throughout history, kings and princely rulers had sought without success to control human thought, that most elusive and invisible power of all. Yet where absolute monarchs had failed, democracy succeeds, for the strength of the majority is unlimited and all-pervasive, and the doctrines of equality and majority rule have substituted for the tyranny of the few over the many the more absolute, imperious, and widely accepted tyranny of the many over the few. In contrast to the marked individualism of earlier American society, Tocqueville saw uniformity, conformity, and a drab sameness as the characteristics of modern democracy. Originally, men sought freedom to break off the brutal chains of inequality fashioned by the monarchies and aristocracies, of old. But as the conditions of men become equal amongst a people, individuals seem of less, and society of greater, importance. Increasingly, then, men in democracies put a premium upon equality and sameness, rather than upon difference, and soon they become intolerant of the very freedom to the different. Besides, in an equalitarian democracy, men are prone to be lost in the crowd of their fellows. They lose respect for their own freedom and individuality, and so become grossly indifferent to the free expressions of individual thought, taste, and desire on the part of all others. In short, democracy and equality are great levelers. Thus, they make it impossible for one man or a few men to oppress the many. But in turn, they make it equally impossible for any one man to be free from the oppression of the many. In consequence, the democratic majority can become the greatest, most absolute tyranny of all. Today, of course, Tocqueville's concern for the growing tyranny of the majority strikes home with particular force. It is true that a half-century after Democracy in America first appeared, Lord Bryce wrote that Tocqueville's tyranny of the majority does not strike one as a serious evil in the America of today. Faint are the traces which remain of that intolerance of heterodoxy in politics, religion, or social views whereon he dilates. But in evaluating Lord Bryce's criticism, one suspects that because he lacked Tocqueville's brilliant and prophetic perceptivity, he simply couldn't fathom what real truth there was to the Frenchman's estimate. Besides, even as Bryce wrote in 1887, the thoroughly majority-oriented democracy that Tocqueville had foreseen and that we experience today had not as yet actually thrust its way through to the surface of American life. Now, however, it has, and modern, frontierless, industrial America, with its factory-made, standardized food, clothing, housing, communications, and even amusements, has surely placed a premium upon sameness, undermined individualism, and created to perfection what contemporary sociologists bemoan as preeminently an age of conformity. With all the tensions of cold and hot wars working towards a rather specious unity of purpose, political nonconformity seems to have all but disappeared, and, generally speaking, the economic, social, and political eccentricities that characterized the days of Washington and Jefferson seem to have been largely swallowed up in our age of mass democracy. To be sure that Tocqueville's dire predictions should in our times have come so much closer to realization is not at all strange, not even in terms of the very factors that he felt would mitigate the growing tyranny of the majority. For Tocqueville saw one such factor in an almost total absence of government intervention in Americans' everyday life. Nothing, he wrote in the 1830s, is more striking to a European traveler in the United States than the absence of what we term government. Yet today one finds the mark of government everywhere. Tocqueville also distinguished between centralized government and centralized administration. A central government, the means by which overall policy is set for the nation, is necessary and virtually indispensable. But administration is a means by which such overall policy is executed, and in Tocqueville's time it was still a separate, decentralized entity, its power placed primarily in state and local agencies, which alone dealt with individuals. However, suggested Tocqueville, if the central power, after having established the general principles of government, descended to the details of their application, and if having regulated the great interests of the country, it could descend to the circle of the individual interests, freedom would soon be banished from the New World. And who today would deny that over the past half-century our federal government has not only established the general principles of government, but also descended to the details of their application, has not only regulated the great interests of the country, but also descended to the circle of individual interests as well. Then, too, when Tocqueville wrote further of the forces in America that mitigated the mass tyranny he feared, he purposefully singled out the independence of the press, the ease with which one might set up his own newspaper, the total absence of centralized press opinion. Yet today, the American press is marked by a constantly declining number of independent publications, by the rise of great newspaper chains, and by a generally pervasive emphasis upon the manufacture of public opinion through the various means of mass communications. Besides, the natural physical substructure of freedom in Tocqueville's time, an open frontier, and the widest range of economic opportunity for the free individual, has almost completely disappeared in our own century. And quite clearly, the free exchange of ideas no longer has its root deep even in our physical environment as it did when Tocqueville wrote. As a result, the questions raised in democracy in America are even more pressing and challenging today than they were when Tocqueville and Beaumont first came to the New World to search out the image of democracy itself with its inclinations, its character, its prejudices, and its passions, in order to learn what we have to fear or to hope from its progress. And hopefully this doesn't jump on me. And of course it did. There we go. There we go. Let's see. Where did I leave off? Freedom, individuality. Alright. So today, of course, Tocqueville's concern for the growing tyranny of the majority strikes home with particular force. I think it jumped a page on me here. There we go. Everywhere, then two. Alright, there we go. Alexis de Tocqueville's great work cannot be fully understood, of course, unless one realizes that the young Frenchman never really despaired of democracy in America. He foresaw an ever-growing tyranny of the majority. He rigorously and lengthily analyzed the many factors in American civilization that seem to lead resolutely towards conformity and the constriction of the open society, and he felt certain that if left to their own devices, Americans would naturally veer away from the individualism of their forefathers. Yet, if conformity seemed destined to be the natural lot of men in democratic ages, then Tocqueville would make individualism, independence, and personal freedom the product of art instead. If, for America, the future seemed destined to sweep away nature's own props to freedom, then Tocqueville was equally determined that new props be constructed in their place. Surely, he wrote, one shouldn't simply assume that freedom and democracy is completely dependent upon the physical presence of an open frontier. If those nations whose social condition is democratic could remain free only while they inhabit uncultivated regions, we must despair of the future destiny of the human race, for democracy is rapidly acquiring a more extended sway, and the wilds are gradually peopled with men. Nor could one rightly abandon democracy, give up hope for freedom within its confines, and turn instead to the re-establishment of those older, more aristocratic patterns of society and government in which freedom had traditionally been more secure. Thus, the question is not how to reconstruct aristocratic society, but how to make liberty proceed out of that democratic state of society in which God has placed us. Freedom and democracy must be man's future objective, and however formidable the obstacles in his path, man's artistry can still make valid what is now a thoughtless and rather magical equation of equality with freedom, of democracy, or majority rule, with liberty. Such was Tocqueville's faith, for it had been otherwise. He wrote, I should not have written this book, but I should have confined myself to deploring in secret the destiny of mankind. I have sought to point out the dangers to which the principle of equality exposes the independence of man, because I firmly believe that these dangers are the most formidable, as well as the least foreseen of all those which futurity holds in store, but I do not think that they are insurmountable. Tocqueville then saw that the very essence of democratic government consists in the absolute sovereignty of the majority, and yet the manner in which democracies might surmount the dangers inherently in majority rule did not escape the Frenchman. He noted the tools which free men might in their artistry create to strengthen their ancient freedoms. And in our own age of conformity, Tocqueville's suggested bulwarks to freedom take on an even greater meaning. An independent press that alone provides the individual a voice with which to appeal from oppression to the whole nation or to mankind itself. Decentralization, which, to the extent that it is feasible, diminishes absolute authority. And local self-government, as well as social, economic, and intellectual associations or groups, which give free men a stake in their society, a sense of responsibility and self-importance that keeps them from being lost in the crowd, and that makes them more jealous of their liberties. Forms, manners, and traditions which men in a democratic times generally hold in contempt, but which mold a protective barrier about our freedoms, encase them in a social framework at times even stronger than the wrathful will of the majority, and a forthright legal profession and judiciary to uphold these forms, to nourish and to defend them. Groups of citizens to guard always the rights and interests of their individual fellows, constantly aware that their own freedom depends upon the extent to which they will defend that of every other citizen. These are but some of the devices that free men themselves can contrive and perpetuate to preserve their liberties and independence against the tyranny of the majority. In our democratic times, the strongest possible drive towards such a tyranny is inevitable, but our submission to it is not. Unlike Pico and the humanists of old, Tocqueville saw man's fate as his own, his destiny awaiting his own creation. I am aware that many of my contemporaries maintain that nations are never their own masters, here below, and that they necessarily obey some insurmountable and unintelligent power arising from anterior events, from their race, or from the soil and climate of their country. Such principles are false and cowardly. Such principles can never produce aught but feeble men and pusillanimous nations. Providence had not created mankind entirely independent or entirely free. It is true that around every man a fatal circle is traced, beyond which he cannot pass, but within the wide verge of that circle he is powerful and free. As it is with men, so with communities. The nations of our times cannot prevent the condition of man from becoming equal, but it depends upon themselves whether the principle of equality is to lead them to servitude or freedom, to knowledge or barbarism, to prosperity or wretchedness. With free will and wisdom, then, men may see the pitfalls of the democratic ages that stretch before them, and then, rather than submit to these pitfalls, the most extreme of which is the subversion of freedom by the tyranny of the majority, they may choose instead a wiser path, the path of freedom and democracy. In abridging the 2 long volumes of Democracy in America, every effort has been made to retain not only the spirit and essential meaning of Tocqueville's classic, but also the most important descriptive and analytical passages as well. Deletions and changes were made at all times with an eye first to the needs and purposes of a general as well as academic audience. Only then were the space requirements of an inexpensive paper-bound edition considered. Thus, though it was not an easy task to pare and cut down this masterpiece of our political and social literature, its best portions are presented here, taken with some modifications from the original Henry Reeve translation as revised by Francis Bowen. For the most part, thorough and enlightening study of Alexis de Tocqueville and his work, the reader is enthusiastically referred to George Pearson's Tocqueville and Beaumont in America. And that was Richard D. Hefner, New York City, from August 5th, 1955. So then we get to the author's introduction, but I think perhaps maybe that's a good place to pick up again next. I think I've been going here for a little over an hour, so we'll pick up on this again here at a later time, so be sure to join me again for that. And in the meantime, Like I said, this should be a fairly good read. Hopefully, you guys will enjoy this. You'll see the parallels of things playing out as we see things play out here today. I probably see a lot of the same themes and mantras described of old, but nonetheless, should be a good read. Hopefully, some good takeaways as well. Alright, well, that is going to do it for this broadcast here this evening. I appreciate you guys tuning in, as always. Be sure to join me again here on the next episode, and we will see you back on the next one. Take care. God bless, everybody.